To the largest book festival in the country. From the campus of UCLA in Los Angeles, it's the Los Angeles Times Festival of Books. About 140,000 people are expected here this weekend on the campus. There are about 450 authors who will be presenting their books, signing books. About 300 different exhibitors are also here. Some of the publishers, there's some bookstores, a lot of children's activities, and Book TV will be live here all weekend. We have Saturday and Sunday schedules. We'll be covering panels. We'll be doing call-in shows with authors, your chance to talk to them. Here's our live schedule for today. Coming up in just a few minutes is the first panel that we'll be covering. It's called the Crisis Points panel. Patricia Goldstone is one of the authors on that panel. She's written a book called Aaronsohn's Maps, the untold story of the man who might have created peace in the Middle East. Lynn Olson is also on that panel. Troublesome Young Men is her book. The rebels who brought Churchill to power and helped save England. Elizabeth Taylor will be moderating that panel. And the third author is Zachary Karabell, author of Peace Be Upon You, 14 Centuries of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish Conflict and Cooperation in the Middle East. That panel begins in just a few minutes. It'll go about an hour. After that, your chance to talk with Ariana Huffington, whose newest book is called Right is Wrong. She'll be on the C-SPAN school bus taking calls. Another panel coming up in about an hour and a half or so. It's called Infamous Lives panel. Nancy Eisenberg has written a book about Aaron Burr. It's called Fallen Founder. She's on that panel along with Michael Neufeld, author of Von Braun, about Willy von Braun, the Nazi scientist who came over and kind of expedited America's rocket program. Dreamer of Space, Engineer of War is that book, and Ken Ackerman is the third author on that panel. Young J. Edgar Hoover, The Red Scare and the Assault on Civil Liberties. That panel is moderated by A. Scott Berg. He's written a book about Charles Lindbergh. And after that, we'll do some more calls. We'll take some more calls. We'll wander around the festival a little bit so you can see it, see some of the activities going on around here. We'll also talk at that point with Elizabeth Samet. She's written a book about Soldier's Heart, reading literature through peace and war at West Point. She teaches literature at West Point. She's written a book about her experiences. And another panel we're covering, this is coming up in about 2.5, 3 hours. It's a history of violence panel. David Bell is the author of The First Total War, Napoleon's Europe, and the Birth of Warfare as We Know It. Mark Kurlansky is another author on that panel. Nonviolence, 25 Lessons from the History of a Dangerous Idea is his book. Scott Martell, Blood Passion, the Ludlow Massacre and Class War in the American West. It's a story about some very violent miners' clash in Colorado in the 19th century. And Andrew Nagorski is also on that panel. The Greatest Battle, Stalin, Hitler, and the Desperate Struggle for Moscow that changed the course of World War II. After that, another chance for you to talk with another author. Dr. Laura Schlesinger, the radio talk show host, will be on the C-SPAN school bus. Stop Whining, Start Living is the name of her book. And finally, one other live panel this afternoon, and that is Lessons from the 20th Century panel. David Goodman, whose sister is Amy Goodman, the radio talk show host. They have co-written a book called Standing Up to the Madness, Ordinary Heroes in Extraordinary Times. Elizabeth Samet is on that book, is on that panel. Soldier's Heart, reading literature through peace and war at West Point. And Clancy Siegel has written a book. It's called A Woman of Uncertain Character, the amorous and radical adventures of my mother Jenny, who always wanted to be a respectable Jewish mom, by her bastard son. That's the title of that book. Tim Neftali will be moderating that panel, and he is, of course, the director of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library. Well, we've been showing you some scenes here live from the LA Book Festival. We're about to go to that first panel. Crisis Points is what it's called. We'll take you to that now.
Welcome everyone. We will be starting in just a moment or two. Again, I'd like to ask for those who did not hear me the first time that we please turn off anything that's going to cause a noise, be it telephone, pager, whatever else. I'm not really techie. I barely know telephone, but anything that's going to cause disruption. Again, if in the event you plan to leave prior to our session concluding, because we're filming, we'd like to ask that you sit at the rear of the room so that you can move without any disruption of the taping, okay? Thank you so much for your cooperation. We appreciate you. Enjoy the taping here today, the panel, and of course, enjoy the festival. We'll be starting in a moment.
I've now Ashgren retired.
Welcome. Thanks so much for coming this morning. Can you hear this? Thanks so much for coming this morning for our discussion about sort of historical crises. It's a beautiful day to discuss disasters from the past, but we were hoping just for a kind of a wonderful conversation with you and our wonderful panelists to look back and think about. The idea is to sort of explain and think about how different historical crises sort of played out in the world, and think about the implications for how we think about the past. The books we'll be discussing raise really interesting questions, and one of the most central ones is one that's resonant today, which is sort of how leaders make decisions in times of crisis. And I hope that when we have questions, you'll sort of be able to kind of try to make some of those connections between today and the past. I'll be introducing the panelists, and we will speak briefly, and we'll converse, and then sort of open it up for questions. With us, I'll proceed down, is Patricia Goldstone, author of Aaronson's Maps, the untold story of the man who might have created peace in the Middle East. Lynn Olson, author of Troublesome Young Men, the rebels who brought Churchill to power and helped save England. And your program may note that Anthony Pageon, author of World at Home, had a family emergency. Actually, as he emailed, a family crisis, which is appropriate for a panel about crises. And so we're thrilled to have Zachary Karabell to stand in for him. And Zachary is the author of Peace Be Upon You, the story of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish coexistence. And we're grateful that he can join us. So let's, Patricia, let's start with you. Sort of, in your book, you introduce readers to an overlooked adventurer, a scientist who altered the course of World War I, and in mapping the Jordan River headwaters, put in place peace plans for the natural boundaries of Palestine. And it's a remarkable character, very colorful, and sort of, can you tell us a little bit about Aaronsohn and how you came upon the story,
Of course.
why he matters?
Well, Aaronsohn was a scientist before the war. He was a hydrographer and a geologist, and he did the first, as a very young man, growing up in Palestine. He came there from Romania at the age of 5 in 1881. He did the first comprehensive, and some people still say the best, geological mapping of Palestine. And during the war, he ran British intelligence in Palestine. He worked at the Arab Bureau in Cairo, and his sister, Sarah, his 27-year-old sister, who was a very beautiful and a very brave young woman, was his chief of operations back in Palestine. And the curious thing about Aaronsohn is that he can be thought of as the un-Lawrence. What struck me as I began researching about his life was that he should have been at least as well known as T.E. Lawrence, and I was very curious to find out why he was not.
And you can talk a little bit more about why he was not. And
well, Aaron was a very controversial figure in his lifetime. He not only worked for the British, he worked for the Turks, and at one point for the Germans. He had tremendous connections in America. He was quite well known before the war. He was even here at UCLA. He came to Los Angeles to study the opening of the Los Angeles Aqueduct, because he was planning even then on creating a similar system for his own country. And after the war, he was tasked at the Paris Peace Conference with creating the boundaries for the new Palestine. He did them according to the Jordan headwaters. He wanted all of these headwaters within the new country, and his plans ran into what the British wanted for that part of the world, part of which was another British mandate in southern Syria. So he came to grief.
Lynn, so many books have been written about World War II that it's hard to find sort of a new and interesting angle, but you have done that to find something that's sort of previously unexposed. And it raises the question, I guess, do dutiful students of history, sort of who believe in the inevitability of Churchill's leadership, do they really have it right? Does the conventional wisdom about Churchill and his ascension need to be rewritten? Was that at all sort of in play in sort of how you came upon the book and how you decided to write it?
Right. The short answer to your question about was his rise inevitable is no, because that's what my book is about.
Yeah, right.
It's the book. Let me just tell you a little bit about what it is. It's a book about a group of Tory members of Parliament who basically risked everything, risked their political careers, risked their lifelong friendships, risked their good names to do what they thought was right, which was to get rid of Neville Chamberlain in May 1940 and to bring Winston Churchill to power. It's a story that really hasn't been done. There are 2 missing years in that period leading up to the war and the early days of the war in England, and that's really from Munich, the Munich Agreement in 1938, when Neville Chamberlain and the French Prime Minister basically gave away much of Czechoslovakia to Hitler, and May 1940, when Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. And historians have tended to glide over those not quite 2 years, a year and a half, and then begin the story, the great story of Winston Churchill in May 1940, when he, rose to the occasion so magnificently and basically did, in my opinion, save Britain, and not only save Britain, saved, really, in my opinion, the rest of the Western civilization. And my husband and I wrote two books that touched on that climactic spring and summer in 1940 when he became Prime Minister. And when we were doing research for those 2 books, I basically, in all the reading that we did, became very clear that his ascension to power was not inevitable. As Winston Churchill himself has written, part of what we think about Winston Churchill comes from what Winston Churchill wrote after the war. He, at one point, said, basically, I'm going to control history because I'm going to write it, his own history. And he did. He did. His multi-volume history of World War II is a basic source for any historian. And he pretty much implies that he stood alone against Chamberlain, and that, he came to power, and that's the way it should have been, as well it should have been. But there were a lot of things going on, and what I write about is how this group of Tory MPs basically rebelled against their own party, their own prime minister, who was very powerful. He was not a weak and vacillating guy like a lot of histories portray him. Stood up against him, and in a very, very dramatic time, basically ousted him, or helped oust him. And as a result, Winston Churchill came to power.
Right, Zachary. In a sense, Patricia and Lynn have presented stories of conflict, but you sort of look at things somewhat in a different way. To look at peace, the Crusades, Inquisition, September 11th have all been seen as examples of constant religious intolerance. But you challenge the conventional wisdom again. This panel's about challenging wisdom. By pointing to periods of peaceful coexistence and sort of asking what can we learn from them. Can you sort of explain that approach, that sort of through studying peace you can kind of avoid conflict?
I mean, first of all, Lynn wrote a book with her husband, which I think probably redefines crisis points in history.
No, she actually has written two previous books, but her husband is actually here, and they're still married. So that's.
I'm glad you asked me that question, because I was kind of trying to figure out how I was going to meaningfully talk about crisis, and then I was thinking it's an election year and I'm going to learn from politicians, which is I wasn't going to answer the question asked. I was just going to answer the question I wanted to answer. So. There is a kind of a meta point here, and we're at UCLA, so I can use the word meta. I've been in business a while, and there is no meta in business. So, history is not just written by the victors, whether it's by Winston Churchill writing about his own version of how he came to power, or, to some degree, the British and the French about the formation of the modern Middle East. It's also, in my view, written from the vantage point of crises and conflict. And part of that, I think, is just human nature, right? There are no novels about a happy family. There are no news reports about a peaceful day, and a weather report in Southern California is fairly boring. So in the same adage of if it doesn't bleed, it doesn't lead, there is really no history of peace, and there's no history of coexistence. And that's not necessarily prejudice, it's just human nature, because frankly, what is peace and coexistence between Muslims, Christians, and Jews in medieval Spain? Juan woke up, a Christian farmer near Toledo, and Ahmed woke up, a Muslim farmer near Toledo, and they both went out to the fields together, and they did whatever they were going to do, and they had lunch, and they talked about the crops or whatever, and then they went home and each said a prayer to their God, who happened to be the same God, but in different languages, and then they went to sleep, which is incredibly boring as a narrative, right? Maybe if I were Richard Ford, I could make that really interesting, but the fact is it's not, and so we don't write about it, and there aren't books about it. And so there's a history of human interaction that's essentially elided from our collective memory, and then it becomes self-reinforcing, because the things that we do read about and the things that we do pay attention to are crises and are conflicts. And then when that gets filtered through a religious lens, it becomes even more heated, and we end up with the formula. And we, by the way, doesn't just mean we in the West, or Christians or Jews, it's everybody. And in the case of Muslims, Christians, and Jews, it's, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, all of whom essentially interpret their history communally as one of conflict and competition, sometimes lethal and sometimes not. And part of it's just you don't write about those centuries of and long caesuras where people just weren't fighting. And then you add to that fact that when people do fight, it tends to sear the memory much more acutely than when people don't. I once taught a class and I had 25 student recommendations, and I mean, I'm not doing this in a back-patting way. 24 of them were very positive, and the 25th said he was terrible. And 8 years later or 12 years later, all I remember is the one that says he sucks, right? The other 24, I have no idea what they said. They didn't say that. So, when people are violent or negative, for good reasons or not, I may indeed have, that may have been the right answer, but that's what sticks in our memory individually and collectively. The danger of that, though, is that, and particularly in a moment like today, where conflict is kind of the name of the game. I mean, you pick up the paper, and yesterday's New York Times said, Iran and Iraq close to a crisis point. That's the headline. I don't think any of the Tribune newspapers are likely to have a headline that says, people woke up in Tehran today and had a good time. Or Lebanese Christian and Muslim shopkeeper opened cafe on the Corniche. That's not a headline. Headline is when bombs are falling. But if all we believe is that the crisis is what's woven through our collective past, and that's the inevitable outcome of this interaction, then it's very difficult to envision a present or a future which has any other outcome, and where the capacity of us to do increasing harm because of technologies and weapons of mass destruction and just the ability of the few to do harm to the many has increased. That notion of the past being an ever-narrowing funnel into lethal conflict in the present and therefore potentially lethal conflict in the future becomes a real issue. So there's a problem with how we write history, and frankly there's a problem with what we gravitate to. It's interesting, the hardcover version of my book was called Peace Be Upon You, The Story of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish Coexistence, which got some nice reviews and sold rather anemically. The softcover version of the book is called Peace Be Upon You, 14 Centuries of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish Conflict and Cooperation. I suppose in the publishing hope that just by inserting the word conflict in there, you would somehow jack up the amount of emotional red meat interest. My suggestion was to actually call it Peace Be Upon You, 14 Centuries of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish Conflict and Cooperation, Anna Nicole Smith, Madonna, and Britney Spears. That didn't make it through the final editing phase. So, I'm happy to talk more about the specifics of the book, but I think that's really what led me to write it. And just one final point on this, that there's a lot of cooperation / coexistence in our present that we don't pay attention to. And I end the book with looking at Dubai. And, Dubai is a problem for people who want to think of coexistence as some sort of noble walk through the daisies, the Rodney King School of History, the can't we all just get along version of the past, and that we sometimes set the bar of coexistence much too high. We think about it as mutual respect. We think about it as Jews sitting down with Muslims and Christians or any combination thereof and saying, we differ greatly about our notions of God and about the interpretation of this one revelation, but I deeply and profoundly respect that difference and have much to learn from you. That's a lovely vision, and it's a kind of a rose-tinted view, by the way, of American religious coexistence, which started much more in terms of I deeply want to kill you, but I don't have the strength to do so. That we really ought to be setting the bar of coexistence much lower, which is, can you live next to someone whose ideas and faith you detest without having an immediate need to do them physical harm? And, from there, maybe you can build up some level of respect and mutual concord. But Dubai is an example of, people basically not caring what you believe. They just care how much money you have in the bank. And that may not be a particularly noble version of coexistence, but it is a real version of coexistence. And there's a lot of that in the Middle East today that we simply don't pay attention to.
Well, and I guess Zachary's also saying that if anyone has a question, he will really only remember the one that's hostile, angry, and, a put down of his book.
That's correct. Thank you.
But otherwise, we're going to try to be a sort of a model of cooperation on this panel, and maybe history will overlook us, but it's an alternative. Just thinking about decision making and leadership, quite often in history, great leaders have been sort of mythologized. They're sort of as visionaries, and they're and idealists. But what about expediency? To what extent are decision makers strategic, self-interested, practical, can you sort of talk about those how decisions were made in sort of the different eras in which you wrote?
Yeah.
Sure.
Well,
whoever wants.
that's a very interesting question in terms of the Paris Peace Conference, where there was, if you read the first-hand accounts of the conference from young diplomats like Harold Nicolson or John Maynard Keynes, who was there as an observer for the British Treasury, you're struck by the tremendous haste in which these world-shattering decisions were made, and there were reasons for that. Europe was actually threatening to go up in flames almost as soon as the war ended. You had the German army, which had handed over its weapons, but had withdrawn behind the borders of Germany and was still essentially intact. And British generals like Haig feared that it might come marching out again. There was reason to march because the British and the French had continued their blockade of Germany long past the armistice, and the reason for that was to make a very expedient political decision to bludgeon Germany into paying onerous war reparations, which Keynes, as some of you probably know, wrote a very blunt tract about after the Paris Peace Conference, saying that the stage was essentially set for World War II right there. But Lloyd George was set on, who was of course Prime Minister of England at the time, Lloyd George was set on delivering these reparations to a public that was totally disillusioned with the war because of the tremendous loss of life. The same condition applied to France, and so the force of decision-making at the Paris Peace Conference really went towards getting these reparations and dividing up the great spoils of the war, which was, of course, the carcass of the Ottoman Empire.
Lynn, why don't we jump in? Zachary, Lynn.
There certainly was expediency in what I write about. The British government was nothing if not expedient in, from 1935 until 1940, basically appeasing Hitler because that was the expedient thing to do. Betraying Czechoslovakia, a small country that was the only democracy in Eastern Europe, because basically wanting to avoid war for good reason. I mean, they hit Britain, France, and everybody else had just gone through this bloodbath 20 years before, and that was the last thing in the world they wanted to do. They also were not prepared militarily, and it was the practical thing to do. The men I write about, who basically, including Churchill, but this other group of Tory MPs, saw beyond the expediency, saw the morality of the question, but also saw that if Britain did not stand up to Hitler fairly quickly, that Britain was going to be the next country to go under. And it took them a year and a half against tremendous resistance in Parliament, but also within the country. The country was not ready for another war. The government made sure that the country did not know what was going on. The press was very much aligned with Neville Chamberlain at the time. The anti-appeasement views of these rebels that I write about and others who were opposed to appeasement did not really appear in the press or in the BBC. The BBC actually barred Winston Churchill from broadcasting for 2 years. It's actually the parallels, I mean, if we want to talk about now, the parallels between now and then were quite startling. I mean, anybody who criticized the government, anybody who said that what was going on was not the right thing to do, was creating trouble with the future, were called unpatriotic, and that they were criticized for damaging the national interest. And as I said when I began, the good names of these people were at stake because they in fact were called traitors to their cause, to their government, and to their party. So it was a question of expediency. Expediency, thank God, did not win out, but it was a close-run thing. The debate that basically toppled Neville Chamberlain and ended up bringing Winston Churchill to power occurred 2 days before Hitler invaded France, Belgium, and the other Low Countries. So it was, I mean, you couldn't have a more incredible drama than what occurred in that 1 week in May 1940.
It's interesting, in a lot of the book, I think there's a strong tendency when people look particularly at Muslim rule over Christians and Jews to confuse power with religious ideology. And this happens time and again, which is to say there are multiple moments of violence and at times oppression toward minorities within empires, but whether this had anything to do with religion versus not is highly debatable. And on the expediency point, if you look at the history of the Ottoman Empire, which doesn't exactly have a good rap in the West. I mean, between sieges of Vienna at the beginning of the 16th century to a well-remembered and kind of epochal moment in Western history, the siege of Vienna in 1683, where the West almost falls to the Ottomans and is saved only by the heroic efforts of Jan Sobieski, the Polish king. Yes, there was a time when a Polish king did save Western civilization. That the Ottomans are remembered as a kind of warmongering horde of Islam that threatens the West, and at times were indeed portrayed that way. What's interesting is that in their own practice within the empire, and this is highly contentious, and it's very difficult to talk about this in the Balkans where emotions run, let's say, high about these things. And the Ottomans were certainly a brutal empire. They conscripted forcefully. They took young Christian boys from villages throughout the Balkans and conscripted them into the army, which the Austro-Hungarians did as well, except the Austro-Hungarians were Christian and the Ottomans were not. But their attitude toward minorities within the empire often was highly expedient. When the Jews are expelled from Spain in 1492 at the end of the Reconquista by Ferdinand and Isabel, who did in fact do other things other than dispatch Columbus to India, where he never actually went. So when they expel all the Jews from Spain, the Ottoman Empire and the Ottoman Emperor says, come on in, because we can use the skills, the banking, the trade, the networks, and they find root in the city of Salonika, which then became Thessaloniki, and for about 450 years, in fact, the Jews were a majority of the city of Salonika until they were deported during the Holocaust. Much better to have been a Jew in Ottoman rule than a Jew under Christian rule for most of that time in terms of the religious tolerance. And one example of this is in the 17th century, a Jewish messiah arises in the city of Izmir named Sabbatai Tzvi. Has anyone heard of Sabbatai Tzvi? So he declares that he's the new Messiah and that the next revelation is going to come, and he's going to antedate the Old Testament and the New Testament and the Quran and announce a whole new revelation. And so he's kicked out of Izmir by the Jewish community, who really is not interested in their own place being disrupted, because he is an immediate threat to whatever the Jewish establishment is. And he spends about 4 years traveling to all the major Jewish communities, kind of like a reverse pilgrimage of Paul, except he's evicted from each place instead of converting people. And so he ends up in Palestine, where he then announces his new messiahdom. And he gathers followers and actually becomes very popular in Eastern Europe because news traveled fast amongst all the various diaspora Jewish communities. And he then marches on Istanbul with about 500 people. Marches all the way up through what's now Turkey and Asia Minor, all the way to about 90 miles outside of Istanbul to the city of Adrianople. And only then, with an armed band of 500 people announcing that he's going to overthrow the Ottoman Empire, proclaim a new revelation, does the Ottoman vizier send out troops to arrest him. They're busy. They're fighting the Austro-Hungarians. They're fighting the Iranians. So they arrest him and they say, you can convert or die. Not because that's an Islamic thing. It's just they weren't going to execute someone who had converted. So he, being a good-natured messiah, converts. He's in prison for a couple of years, and he says, just kidding, I wasn't really converting. And they say, you can't really do that. It's sort of a one-way ticket. The point of this is this guy announces that he's going to overthrow the empire, has an armed band of people, new revelation, challenging the whole nature of Islam. And for 10 years, the Ottoman authorities don't care. Because from a perspective of expediency, someone wandering around in the hinterland of the empire with a few hundred people saying whatever he's saying represented no threat whatsoever. And so they didn't care ideologically. Only when he shows up 90 miles from the capital do they care. I mean, it would be like David Koresh wandering from Waco, Texas to Bismarck, North Dakota, and only when he shows up in Arlington, Virginia with 1,000 people and guns does the government say, okay, enough. And that kind of expediency is much more the norm within Muslim rule before the 20th century than any sort of religious orthodoxy or intolerance.
Let's see if there's some questions. Because this is a hearing on C-SPAN, if you can make your way to these microphones, it would be great. Make your way. And while you're traveling, come on down. Maybe I'll just ask. So none of you are university professors. You're affiliated with institutions, but so one central sort of link between these books is that you there's great writing in them, and in a sense of immediacy and a fresh eye. I'm just wondering, sort of, was there anything that where in universities, the world, the sort of the collective memory seems to have congealed about certain topics. I'm wondering if there's a point where any of you thought that you were taking a really unpopular view, a very unpopular interpretation that really had really challenged everything academics or others had been saying about your topics.
I thought so in the beginning. I was really nervous about writing this book. It's my fourth book. I wrote two, as we said, I wrote two with my husband. And we're still very happily married. I had two trepidations about this book. I desperately wanted to do it. The two trepidations were, one, I'm an American writing about a very British subject, and I know what British academics and British reviewers can do to a book that they don't like, and I know how kind of sometimes Americans are looked down upon for treading on British subjects, and so that was a real concern for me. The second was, I'm a woman writing about a very, very male world. It's the story of public school old boys network that dominated British society and government in the 1930s and 1940s. There are women in my book, but if you read most histories of this period, you don't find many women. There was one woman member of parliament who played a fairly important role, but she usually is not written about terribly much. So I was concerned, and I'm going against the whole idea that Churchill basically did it all. I was very happy to discover that when my book came out, that I'll tell you a very, very quick story. The first major review of my book was in the Washington Post. I knew it was going to be in the Washington Post. We live in Washington. I knew the day. I did not see the review. They don't send out the reviews before. So I took our dog out for a walk at about 7 in the morning. I had no idea who was reviewing the book either. And I picked up the paper, threw it all away except for the book review section, and was reading it, as I was walking down the street with my dog. And it was by David Cannadine, who, if any of you know, he is one of the preeminent British historians on modern 20th century British history, particularly World War II in Winston Churchill. And I saw his name and my heart sank, I kid you not. And then I read the review, and it was a rave review. And then after that, anybody could have written anything about this book, and I wouldn't have cared. I mean, I had this one review that I could show everybody. It was well received in England, and that is great. I think people just in academia just accepted the story, that there were that basically World War II for Britain started in May 1940. That was the courageous time. That was the heroic time. That was the wonderful time. The time before is something that we would just as soon forget, the phony war and what was going on with Neville Chamberlain. And so nobody really spent much time looking at it. But yes.
Interesting also that Cannadine had written a biography of Mellon, so great Brit ending, and so he may be sensitive to that. Standing patiently, a question.
I wanted to ask about the breakup of Yugoslavia, and particularly, Zachary, your thesis is that coexistence is more the norm, and that perhaps it's really the role of Milosevic that causes the conflict and the breakup to be as painful as it was. And I wonder if you could speak to that, or whether there was an inevitability to it becoming a conflict.
Yeah, I really try to avoid talking about difficult aspects of my thesis. Yugoslavia presents one of these, which is the real story? Lebanon is the same thing. Is the story the fighting, or is the story the centuries where people didn't fight? And the problem, of course, is that when people fight, the centuries when they weren't fighting kind of disappear. So suddenly, as Yugoslav or Serbian nationalism was becoming a big deal, 1383 to 1990 became the through line, right? The other 600 years where the Serbs were not fighting against everybody else, the Bulgars and the Serbs and the Montenegrins and the Albanians and the Kosovars and the Macedonians and whomever else, that history drops away. And when there were those long periods where there was intermarriage and people living side by side and commingling or intermarrying, for instance, you always know what's going on by all the rules that are passed against it. I mean, nobody ever passes rules against something that isn't happening. So if there were rules about no intermarriage in Balkan villages, it's because there was intermarriage in Balkan villages. So there's a lot of interaction that it certainly counts as coexistence. And again, I do think Lebanon is the best parallel to what went on in Yugoslavia. The 19th and 20th century do bring about a kind of nationalism that's based on sort of ethnicity, language, religion, all woven into some sort of confusing, potent soup. Although I don't really think you can weave anything into soup, so that counts as a very bad mixed metaphor for those of you writing and paying attention at home. So the degree to which that becomes a force that really trumps a lot of other aspects of history is a real dynamic of the modern world that in many ways just wasn't as present before that. I mean, you just don't have kind of religious, ethnic, linguistic nationalism at the level that you do in the 19th and 20th century. And that clearly proved to be a much more toxic force than religion, which allowed for a lot of living side by side, some of it pragmatic and some of it expedient. So yeah, I don't believe that the breakup of Yugoslavia is as it was described at the time. Oh, they've been fighting for centuries. By the way, whenever people start to fight, you find the times in the past they start to fight. So if suddenly there's a civil war in the United States in like 60 years between the North and South, somebody will say, oh, they've been fighting forever. Because within some aspect of memory, that's true. But it's only true with a lot of forgetting mixed in.
Any other questions, please come down. Otherwise, we'll keep talking. I'm just wondering, sort of standing back, how you think your books kind of speak to conflict today? Any?
Well,
yeah.
Yes, I had a similar reaction, Ray, Lynn's earlier question, because Aaronsohn is usually thought of, if at all, as an icon of the far right in Israel. And the very interesting thing about researching him is that he actually had nothing against the Arabs. That was an addition by later historians. If he had any animosity, it was truly towards the British, who starved him and his agents of funds while they were risking their lives in Palestine, and this led directly or indirectly to Sarah's horrible death at the hands of the Turks. She died after 4 days of torture. She ended up killing herself. But and it was quite intimidating to take him on in that sense. But what he did is so important. If you examine it in the light of what is going on today, it has everything to do with the current dispute between Israel and Syria over the Golan Heights, which is emerging into the news once again, because what he wanted at the Paris Peace Conference was the northern boundary between what was then Palestine and Syria, which contained, of course, the Golan Heights. And he wanted it in order to develop the resources, in order to institute a unified, state-of-the-art water development system. He anticipated receiving a lot of funding from the United States, where he had great contacts in the scientific community and also in the financial community. Jacob Schiff, who was the head of the Wall Street community at the time, was an ardent supporter of Aaron's. And he said quite bluntly in an interview with a State Department representative named William Yale that he did not see much of a future for the new country if there were not a solid economic partnership between the Arabs and the Jews. And he saw that water would be a very real and tangible good over which they could at least begin to cooperate.
Can I, in terms of today, the reaction to my book I found incredibly fascinating in terms of today, conflict in politics. My book is, I wrote it, as I said, there were a lot of parallels to today, and I looked at it from a specific point of view and was surprised when it was published that both liberals and conservatives embraced it. I got a fan letter from Karl Rove 2 weeks after it was published. Thanks to Karl Rove, President Bush read it.
They have a lot of spare time on their hands.
Oh, yes, absolutely. But at the same time, I got an email from Howard Wolfson, who is Hillary Clinton's communications director. But it was so fascinating. It's a Rorschach test to read my book, because everybody sees themselves as Winston Churchill or these rebels. You know, moral and political courage has always been in fairly short supply in politics, regardless of the country. Whether you're liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican, they all see themselves as standing up for what they believe and showing moral and political courage. And so I've just found it just unbelievably fascinating to see the reaction.
Right. It's all about them.
Right.
But good morning. Good morning. I wanted to ask you, we've talked about narratives and big ideas, and I just wanted to ask about writer's craft and your style of exposition and how it's changed either depending on the topic that you're writing about or if it's changed depending on where you're at in your personal growth as an author. So writer's craft.
Right. You can all speak to that, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah. It gets easier. I find this, as I said, this is the fourth one I've written. When we started, Stan and I wrote a book together called The Murrow Boys, which was about Edward R. Murrow and the correspondence he hired to create CBS News. We handed it an 800-page manuscript, knowing it was probably pretty long, but thinking very naively that our editor could whittle it down. 800 pages. He could tell us what was what should be in there and what wasn't. He basically threw it back and said, either you edit it or it's not published. It does, for me, organization was a problem, and it has become a tremendous, as you do it, it becomes, at least for me, much, much, much easier. When I do research, I see in my mind's eye where it's going to go, how it's going to be developed, and so I can sit down and not feel like I'm going to shoot myself every morning, which I don't know about other writers, but writing is not fun. It is great fun to have written and to be on panels like this and to pontificate about this amazing thing that you've produced. But it's like pregnancy. It's not fun when you're going through it at all. Every morning you wake up and think, why in the hell am I doing this? And but the result at the end is something that you will love for the rest of your life. So.
That's great.
Well, I found that in writing Aaronsohn's maps, the method of investigation really told the story for me. It was a treasure hunt, essentially. I started out with fragments that I read in various books. I researched the period. I found where points of interest intersected. This was all extremely time-consuming. And then I visited the Public Records Office in London, which is where British government records are kept. And I found myself getting into a thicket of yellow notes, which are what the scrupulous archivists of the PRO, and they are very scrupulous, leave behind to indicate where pages of a sensitive nature have been removed. And then it became a game of pin the tail on the donkey. Okay, what's the issue of sensitive nature that's been removed? And that's really what developed the storytelling technique in the book.
I love the fact that any government can consider anything that happened 88 years ago as something of a sensitive nature. Don't give away intelligence, sources, and methods. Their great-grandson may be alive under a different name living somewhere. I think writing often is subject-dependent, it very much depends on what the audience is and what the subject demands. Some subjects are, I think, by nature a little more florid and lend themselves to more rich, engaging narrative, and some are a little more discussional and more casual. The hard thing about writing about, to some degree, the history of the Middle East, or an interaction with Christians and Jews throughout long periods of time where people don't have a lot of historical memory. Although, oddly enough, we were discussing before the academic legacy. I mean, there's a wealth of books about interactions between Muslims, Christians, and Jews, peacefully and not, in any university library. The degree to which that knowledge and that memory has seeped out into popular culture is extraordinary in its paucity. And I mean, I think there are reasons for that, but it's not an absence of knowledge. It's an absence of collective memory or selective memory. And the hard thing about writing about topics about the Middle East or topics about Arabs and Iranians and Jews from different times is that, frankly, linguistically, we don't tend to remember the names. They don't lodge in our memory. It's a similar issue writing about China. So when I would have people read the manuscript and, you know, there'd be Abdurrahman II and Uthman IV and Mehmed II and names that just didn't roll trippingly off of most people's tongues, whereas you can write a book about American history and reference most presidents without people in any way stopping at that. You know, there's a degree of collective consciousness, even if people don't remember the details, that doesn't interrupt the narrative that you simply don't have when you write about unfamiliar terrain in different languages. And in a lot of ways, that led me to take out some of the details, probably for the better of the narrative, but definitely in a way that, you know, raises that issue of how popular should your history be, how much should you deal with that. And it's something that I don't have an answer to, but you face when you write about unfamiliar peoples and unfamiliar times in unfamiliar languages. Not that I was writing in unfamiliar languages. I mean, I think I was writing in English, but we'll leave that to all of you to determine.
I have to try to figure out how to word this, but I'm interested in this issue of expediency and morality. I hear you saying that expediency seems to determine what happens in history, partly because of politics and partly because of human nature. I see, I also know that you all write about the past, and I look at the present and I see some very strong moral issues which can destroy not only this country but probably the whole Western civilization, unless moral issues somehow become important. And clearly up to now they really haven't. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about whether or not we are doomed to expediency being the thing that pushes what happens, or whether there is any possibility that morality can enter. I don't mean religious morality. I mean morality like, well, like for example, the green issue and the fact that democracy has been compromised in so many ways and that corporations don't seem to be that concerned with the common good. Do you see anything that might direct us towards a moral perspective in terms of what may happen in the future?
You know, I mean, it's a complicated question, obviously, and there is a way of looking at the past that suggests that when governments who tend to have a monopoly of force, no matter what the political era is, or anyone who has a monopoly of force, starts to act from something that is not purely about survival and self-aggrandizement, but transforms into this idea of morality universally applied, that dangerous things tend to ensue. So that doing good at the world at the end of a sword is always to say the least, complicated and compromising problem, and the legacy of societies doing that is mixed at best and horrendous at worst. So, given a choice between expediency and self-interest by human institutions that are inherently both fallible, venal, selfish, limited, occasionally noble. I mean, nobody wants to look at themselves in the mirror and think they're doing anything for anything other than noble and elevated reasons, and most people convince themselves that that's what they're doing in every era. But, you know, given a choice between a kind of an explicitly moral notion, which does lead to things like crusades, literal and metaphoric, versus pure self-interest, which also can lead to not pursuing certain things simply because the price is too high and the current world is worth preserving, I suppose I would take expediency over morality.
I have a different take on your question, and I don't know if it really answers it. But one of the reasons I did the book I did is to show that people who are not very powerful can make a difference. That it is not just historical forces. It's not a deus ex machina that changes history. It's actually people, and a lot of times it's people who are not, in the higher councils of government. The men I write about were not big deals in the British government. They were backbenchers. They had no power. None of them. Harold Nicholson, whom Patricia referred to, was one of them. They had no power. They had no influence. They were up against an all-powerful prime minister who had this huge majority in Parliament, who had the press totally behind him. Nobody thought that they were going to be able to do anything, and they did, because they had the courage of their convictions, because they actually stood up, as I said, for what they believed was right. It's true that the events were with them at the time. I mean, Britain was about to totally collapse if nothing was done. But if it hadn't been for them, it may not have happened. And Britain might well have gone down to defeat at that point. But it took this small band of men to do it. And by doing what they did, they started a chain reaction that ended, thank God, in Winston Churchill coming to power. So whether that can happen right now, I don't know. But it certainly has happened in the past you talk about crisis point. This is one of the major crisis points in history. And they did it.
Although, they're too right. They're doing what's right because they believe that's what's in the absolute imperative best interest of the nation.
Right.
In that sense, there may be something different about personal morality as expressed in what's the best way for us to collectively serve our interests versus kind of a public or an official morality that the policy then flows from. And yours is a really perfect example of passionate conviction that what the leaders were doing at that time was deeply deleterious to the interests of the nation.
Yes, exactly.
Well, to add to what both Lynn and Zachary were saying, I think, particularly in looking at the time I was examining, what was really the deciding factor in the leaders' decision-making process was domestic politics. So I think one response to your question is that a well-informed, literate, caring general population is the best, both the best defense and the best offense. A general population that demands the truth from its leaders, from its media, and makes noise when it doesn't get it.
That's very interesting.
Does anyone have any questions from their seats? Because it's a little hard to get from there to there. We can repeat it. So.
I guess it's a question more for Patricia. You are talking about the Palestine and the way it was partitioned by the Western countries. Was there any possible way of doing it differently? Have they been listening to local leaders? Were there other thoughts or plans in place that may have not brought us to the state we're in now with the country?
Well, that's a very good question. Yes, the question is, could Palestine have been subdivided at the time of the Paris Peace Conference in any other way that would have avoided the problems that ensued? And I'm assuming that you do mean at the time of the Paris Peace Conference, because this is a very long process. But what was really going on here was that England and France were both trying to renege on a secret treaty called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was made in 1915, in which England and France divided up Syria and Palestine, which were at that time, one country, one large and quite rich country. At the Paris Peace Conference, what France wanted was a lock on the Mediterranean. She wanted the long seacoast of Syria and what is today Lebanon because it provided access to the seaports of Europe. Britain did not want this to happen because Britain was after the oil in Mesopotamia and Persia. And did not want its access controlled, but the access to its markets, I should say, controlled by France. Before they were allies in World War I, France and Britain had long-standing rivalries and wars, and this alliance was a relatively new thing, and it actually didn't stand up too well under pressure.
One last question, Polly. But
I wonder if you could comment on the role of FDR or our American ambassadors in having Churchill become prime minister.
That should be Lynn, I think. FDR
Lynn.
Is outside my remit.
I'm sorry, Lynn, yeah, the one on Churchill. Yeah.
FDR and American officials had absolutely no role in Churchill becoming prime minister. At that point, actually, the view of Churchill in the Roosevelt administration was one of a alcoholic has-been, basically. Joseph Kennedy, who was our ambassador to Britain, had really poisoned the mind of Roosevelt and others. And there was a feeling that Churchill at that point was First Lord of the Admiralty, and he had been brought back into the government by Chamberlain. But he was not regarded in England or in America as the predestined prime minister if Chamberlain were to go. In fact, most people in Parliament, and certainly, as I said, in the Roosevelt administration, thought that he would never make it. So there really was very little connection. Roosevelt and Churchill had started their famous correspondence at that time, but basically Roosevelt was keeping open his bets. He was saying that he thought that there was a very faint possibility Churchill might become prime minister. So he did ask that they write letters back and forth to each other, but they had no role in it.
I guess sort of a last question is can you just talk a little bit, following up on your earlier thoughts of sort of the resonance today of your books? What can we learn, and what does it say about our contemporary leaders after reading your books? Any thoughts, any lessons to be learned?
I think they wish they could be, that they could be what Winston Churchill and those people were. I mean, it's so easy to look back and we have 20/20 hindsight, and we see the courage, and we see and we saw what happened as a result of Winston Churchill becoming prime minister. Nobody knew that at the time. I mean, nobody knew what was going to happen by getting rid of Chamberlain. I mean, there were some people that thought that it was just going to be catastrophe if Winston Churchill came into power. So it's easy for leaders to look back and say, oh, well, I'm Winston Churchill. That's me. It's not that easy, and I think that our political leaders need to see themselves as they are, and what they can do, and not model themselves after a man who wasn't really sure all that time of what he was doing either.
Right, Zachary, last comment.
Despite the grandiose desires of authors, writing a book about peace is not going to create peace in the world, and everybody reading it is not going to lead to it. And if you strapped down Osama bin Laden and made him memorize every word of my book, it's not going to lead to great changes in life. But that being said, history does not provide clear lessons. People in the present, whatever that present is, want it to and look for them. And the great thing about the past is that it could basically provide any lesson for anything you want to do in the present. But a very selective reading of the past, therefore, limits the smorgasbord of options for what you think is possible. We do look to antecedents, we do look to our families and our collective history for some sense of what is possible, feasible, right, and if all we remember are aspects that reinforce our grimmest, most destructive inclinations, our most antinomian impulses, rather than the possibilities of almost anything is possible, and that the world is essentially what one makes of it, and that these tendencies of both conflict and cooperation, of both respecting others, being indifferent to others, whether it's Muslims, Christians, and Jews, or other religious faiths, that allows for, I think, a less tense view of not only is our present intractable, but it's at the sharp end of an intractable 1,400 years of the past. And that, in my view, is simply, not only is it false, it's destructive. And that the memory of moments in time where that simply wasn't the case, and where people simply came to some level of mutual common ground, and that continues today, and to be more attentive to the examples of that in our present, which are not difficult to find but are also not easy to see, will do ourselves much good going forward.
Thanks. Well, with that comment, we shall sort of go back to the outside world and leave this enlightenment behind. Thanks to our wonderful panelists. And I'm sure that they would be delighted to sign books outside. Thank you.
If you would like to, meet the authors at the book signing area, they will be at the north signing area. When you exit here, you follow the green flag to your right, and follow the green flag to the orange flag to your right, and you'll come to the yellow flag, which is just on the other side of the building, make a left, and you're at the north signing area. And thank you so much for your cooperation.
And the failure of the political system to adjust accordingly. So at one point, the political system represented more or less the demographic.
Thank you so much for exiting. We do have to prepare for the next panel, so if we could do this expeditiously, it would be appreciated. Enjoy the remainder of your day here at the UCLA LA Times Festival of Books.
And as you can see, the Crisis Points panel is all over. Starting in about a half an hour or so in that same room is a panel on infamous lives. Nancy Eisenberg wrote a book on Aaron Burr. Michael Neufeld wrote a book on Willy von Braun. And Ken Ackerman wrote about J. Edgar Hoover. Those three authors will be in that room in about half an hour. It's a beautiful weekend here in Los Angeles. We're at the Los Angeles Festival of Books, live from the UCLA campus. And now joining us is the author of this book, Right is Wrong.